June 4, 1943, Railroad Street in Mexia, Texas, stood as the unlikely stage for a quiet revolution in thought that would ripple across continents. On that humid summer evening, a German prisoner of war named Anna Fritzia Vera Burkhardt gripped his pencil with a nervous hand. He bent over his hidden diary, carefully inscribing words that, if ever discovered by his own officers, could have earned him solitary confinement or worse. "The Americans must be lying to us," he wrote. No nation could possess such abundance while fighting a war on two fronts. Yet even as he recorded his disbelief, the evidence unfolded before his very eyes. Through the train's window, he had just witnessed a vision that demolished years of Nazi propaganda. Electric lights glowing across the Texas plains like a constellation, blazing from farmhouses, shop windows, and street corners. It was 10 p.m., and the countryside was alive with illumination. In contrast, Germany had lived in blackout conditions since 1940, its cities and villages cloaked in darkness to evade Allied bombers. Even before the war, rural electrification in Germany had reached barely 1/5 of its farms. Now here, in a nation that Nazi rhetoric had described as decayed and collapsing, electricity poured forth as if it were as natural and plentiful as air. The sense of shock deepened as the German soldiers stepped off the train. These men 850 veterans of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's fabled Afrika Korps had not been herded in cattle cars or freight wagons. Instead, they had been transported across the American heartland in cushioned Pullman coaches, complete with dining service and sleeping berths. Used to brutal efficiency, they could scarcely believe that enemy prisoners would be treated with such consideration. The entire town of Mexia had gathered to witness their arrival, curious faces lining the streets, unaware that they were also playing a role in dismantling a world that had been hammered into these soldiers for years. This moment marked more than a transfer of captives. It was the beginning of a profound psychological transformation. Nazi ideology, built on illusions of superiority and invincibility, would begin to unravel not through bullets, but through exposure to the sheer scale of American industrial and social capacity. The collapse of Germany's North African campaign had set this chain of events in motion. On May 13, 1943, in Tunisia, General Jurgen von Arnim Rommel's replacement surrendered along with as many as 275,000 German and Italian troops. Among them were the most battle-hardened men of the Wehrmacht, soldiers who had pushed the British to the very borders of Egypt and won even the grudging respect of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. To these men, defeat had seemed unthinkable. Yet here they were, suddenly prisoners in enemy hands, stripped of weapons but not yet stripped of pride. One such man was Feldwebel Friedrich Radke, a decorated veteran who had earned the Iron Cross First Class and endured wounds in North Africa. His diary, later uncovered in the U.S. National Archives, became one of the most detailed accounts of the astonishing shift in perception these soldiers would undergo. The journey into captivity began at Oran, Algeria, where Radke and tens of thousands of others waited in makeshift camps for transport to America. It was there that the cracks first appeared in their old certainties. American efficiency in processing prisoners left many stunned. Thousands were registered daily with a speed and order that surpassed even the Wehrmacht at the height of its power. Identity cards were issued, photographs taken, medical exams conducted, and inoculations administered, all while officers fluent in German explained their rights under the Geneva Convention. The discipline was clinical, professional, and humane, challenging the caricature of Americans as lazy or disorganized. But perhaps the most disarming blow to their beliefs came from something as simple as food. Obergefreiter Hans Murer, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, wrote to his mother months later that in Oran's holding cages they were fed better than in 6 months of desert warfare. White bread, real coffee, and meat served twice a day were not propaganda stunts, as many first suspected. They were standard American military rations. This revelation carried more weight than statistics or speeches ever could. These soldiers had starved, fought, and bled for a regime that insisted its enemies were decadent and weak. Now, standing face with their captors, they realized the truth was exactly the opposite. As the German prisoners prepared to board ships bound for the United States, the vessels themselves added another layer to the unfolding revelation. They were liberty ships, mass-produced cargo vessels that symbolized the unstoppable output of American industry. One, the SS Robert E. Peary, had been built in just 4 days and 15 hours in California, an achievement that to German ears would have sounded like absurd propaganda. Yet these ships were real, constructed at the pace of 3 per day at the height of production. Rather than return empty after delivering supplies to Europe, they now carried human cargo up to 30 prisoners each month by the summer of 1943. For the Germans, who had been taught to believe in the superiority of their engineering and organization, this efficiency and scale were incomprehensible. And with every passing day, every loaf of bread, every light bulb, and every machine they encountered, the myth of Nazi supremacy weakened further. The 2-week Atlantic voyage in the summer of 1943 marked the next stage of the German prisoners' psychological dismantling. Once again, the blows to their certainty did not come from weapons or speeches, but from ordinary details of American life that they could not reconcile with the world they thought they knew. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division kept a meticulous account of the journey in letters to his family, and his words capture the dawning realization that Germany's war machine was hopelessly outmatched. What struck him most was not the naval escort, not the radar equipment on board, but the food waste he witnessed daily. The ship's crew threw away more in a single day than my entire company received in a week's rations during the final months in Africa, he wrote. Half-eaten steaks, loaves of bread tossed aside, gallons of milk poured away simply because they had sat too long. All of it discarded without malice or mockery, simply because the supply seemed limitless. For men who had fought and starved under conditions of scarcity, such casual abundance was beyond comprehension. The Liberty ships themselves became floating monuments to American industrial might. Guards explained, often without hesitation, that these were but a few of the 710 identical vessels produced during the war. Each ship contained 250 individual parts assembled from components manufactured in 32 states, with engines built in sections at separate factories and joined together in ports that had scarcely existed before the conflict. To a German officer steeped in the mythology of his nation's engineering supremacy, this scale was staggering. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stobern, descended from a Prussian military family, later admitted in his memoirs that he realized Germany was already defeated when he saw radar antennae spinning atop a simple cargo vessel. Radar, he had believed, was a rare technology reserved for Germany and perhaps Britain, yet here it was, standard issue even on merchant ships. The contrast between what Germany considered a strategic secret and what America treated as everyday equipment was too stark to ignore. When the ships docked at Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia on August 2, 1943, whatever fragments of Nazi propaganda still clung to the prisoners' minds began to collapse entirely. Spread across 300 acres, Norfolk's docks stretched farther than the eye could follow. Cranes moved with electric power, lifting loads that would have required teams of men and horses in Germany. In a single day, this one port handled more tonnage than Hamburg managed in a week. Prisoner Gerhard Johann Weber, a factory worker before his conscription, counted nearly 50 cargo ships in various stages of loading or unloading. The sheer coordination, the movement of cranes, the hum of power lines, the endless procession of vehicles, conveyed a level of industrial strength that made every comparison with Germany painful. Even the workers' personal lives told a story. Hundreds of civilian automobiles filled the parking lots near the docks. In Germany, car ownership remained a luxury reserved for party elites and the wealthy, with the much-hyped Volkswagen still little more than a propaganda dream. Here, dock workers, ordinary men and women, drove themselves to work in their own vehicles, evidence of prosperity woven into the fabric of daily life. The shock deepened further when the prisoners boarded trains that would carry them into the American interior. They expected freight wagons, cramped 40 and 8, cars designed for soldiers or livestock. Instead, they entered full passenger coaches. Pullman cars provided padded seats that converted into berths. Dining cars offered meals served on tables with silver cutlery and white cloths, and observation cars allowed wide views of the countryside rolling past. Feldwebel Rad confessed in his diary, "We boarded like tourists, not prisoners." American guards seemed almost embarrassed by the comforts, with one apologizing for a malfunctioning air conditioner. Air conditioning, an unheard of luxury to most Germans, was treated as a minor inconvenience in the middle of August. The prisoners, already overwhelmed, could not reconcile this casual abundance with the image of America that had been fed to them for years. The 3-day train journey from Norfolk to Texas and Oklahoma hammered away at the last illusions. As the locomotives pulled them through Virginia, North Carolina, and beyond, the prisoners pressed their faces to the glass. Town after town glowed with electric lights, even late into the night. In Germany, blackout rules had darkened entire cities, but here small towns displayed neon shop signs, lit windows, and bustling streets. In factories along the route, night shifts churned ceaselessly. Parking lots filled even at midnight. When the train paused at Roanoke, Virginia, they watched workers refuel and service locomotives with a speed and mechanization that dwarfed anything they had seen at home. Automated coal loaders, electric pumps, and lubrication systems turned what would have taken German crews hours into a half-hour routine. Even more startling was the prosperity of the workers themselves. They wore boots that cost more than a month's wages back in Germany. They drank Coca-Cola from bottles, smoked cigarettes freely, and discarded them half-used. One electrical engineer among the prisoners calculated that the single railway yard consumed more electricity in an hour than his entire Berlin district used in a day. He recorded with awe and disbelief, the waste was magnificent. It was the carelessness of infinite resource. Each mile of track, each lit street, each factory window glowing in the night dismantled the mythology that had sustained the Afrika Korps through years of hardship. These men had once believed that Germany stood at the pinnacle of modernity, that its enemies were decadent shadows propped up by propaganda. Now, staring at the seemingly endless energy and production of America, they realized that their world had been built on lies. The real demolition of Nazi ideology had not come from defeat in battle. It was unfolding, quietly but inexorably, through the simple power of observation. As the trains carried the German prisoners deeper into the American interior, their sense of disorientation only grew. Passing through Tennessee and Kentucky, they began to grasp that the industrial might of the United States was not confined to its ports or naval bases, but stretched across every corner of the nation. Through the wide Pullman windows, they saw factories that dwarfed anything they had known in Germany. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee, for example, stretched for miles along the riverbank, its furnaces consuming a staggering 175 kilowatts of electricity, more than the entire city of Munich. Such numbers were incomprehensible to men who came from a land where electricity was rationed and factories often operated with shortages. Near Louisville, their train slowed beside a complex of synthetic rubber plants. Built in just 18 months on what had once been empty fields, 4 massive facilities now churned out 800 tons of rubber annually, to prisoners like Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from the German giant IG Farben. The sight was devastating. Germany had invented synthetic rubber, yet had never managed more than 120 tons in a year. To see America producing more than 6 times that amount, and treating it as routine, revealed just how far behind their homeland lagged. Each facility was more advanced than anything we had built. Hoffman recalled years later, and they told us there were dozens more across the country. The myth of Germany's scientific superiority had begun to crumble. The trains pressed on toward Detroit, and soon the Germans encountered perhaps the most crushing symbol of American industry, the Ford Willow Run plant. Visible from miles away, this sprawling factory had been constructed in just 9 months and now produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. At peak output, 42 0 workers assembled aircraft from over 1.5 million parts manufactured by 500 subcontractors. The plant consumed more electricity than the entire city of Cologne. Luftwaffe pilot Hartmann Verli, shot down over Tunisia, watched from the train window and counted 17 bombers in various stages of assembly. We had been told American planes were inferior, rushed and unreliable, he later wrote, but I could see the precision of their assembly lines. These were not weak machines, they were built faster than we could even imagine possible. By the time the trains crossed the Mississippi River at St. Louis, the destruction of Nazi mythology was nearly complete. Below them, barges carried enough grain to rival Germany's entire 1942 harvest. On both banks, elevators stored mountains of wheat that could feed cities for months. Prisoners who had grown up in rural Bavaria or Saxony were shaken by the sight. One farmer's son noted in his diary that a single barge carried enough food to feed his entire village for 5 years. When guards casually explained that such shipments were common, the prisoners realized that Germany's food shortages were not the universal wartime reality they had been led to believe, but the result of their nation's relative weakness. In Kansas City, the train stopped near sprawling stockyards where tens of thousands of cattle waited for slaughter. The air was thick with the smell of meatpacking plants. For soldiers who had survived in Africa on meager rations of 200 grams of meat per week, the sight of American workers eating beef sandwiches during lunch breaks was almost unbearable. One guard bought the prisoners hamburgers from a stand, meat, cheese, vegetables, and soft white bread. The Germans were astonished that such a meal cost only 15 cents, and even more astonished that the guard paid for 20 burgers with a single dollar bill as if it were nothing special. For them, this simple act carried more weight than speeches. It proved that for Americans, abundance was the norm, not the exception. Their arrival at Camp Hearn in Texas pushed this revelation even further. Built in only 4 months, the camp housed nearly 50,000 prisoners in conditions that exceeded what many had known as civilians back in Germany. Wooden barracks had electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heating. Each building used more lumber than an entire German village could muster. The camp hospital stunned the prisoners' medical personnel. Oberstleutnant Dr. Friedrich Bauer, a surgeon, found himself working in a facility better equipped than most German civilian hospitals. There were X-ray machines, sterilized surgical instruments, and, most astonishingly, supplies of penicillin. Miracle drug Germans had only heard rumors about. The Americans used it liberally, even on prisoners with minor infections, while German soldiers were dying for lack of even basic sulfur drugs. The camp kitchens, too, became classrooms in American abundance. POW assigned to cooking duties discovered walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, automated dishwashers, and gas ranges capable of preparing meals for thousands at a time. Their rations included milk, eggs, fresh vegetables, and meat in quantities German civilians had not seen since before 1939. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, once a hotel chef in Munich, was shaken by the waste. Regulations required that cooks prepare 10% more food than needed, and whatever went uneaten was thrown away. We discarded more bread today than my family has seen in 3 years, he recorded bitterly. For men who had fought under starvation conditions, the sight of good food tossed into garbage bins was almost incomprehensible. By the fall of 1943, America's labor shortage led to German prisoners being sent out to work in fields and factories across the country. This decision, made out of necessity, would prove far more devastating to Nazi ideology than any deliberate re-education effort. Each day, groups of prisoners were transported without blindfolds, traveling freely through towns, farms, and industrial centers. They saw endless fields of corn and wheat, shops bursting with goods, parking lots filled with cars, and homes equipped with radios and refrigerators. In every direction, America defied the image painted by Nazi propaganda. It was not a weak, divided society. It was a land of abundance, powered by machines and organized on a scale Germany could not begin to match. By late 1943, German prisoners of war were no longer confined to the boundaries of their camps. America's severe labor shortages, especially in agriculture and industry, meant that groups of POW were sent daily to fields, factories, and processing plants. What began as a pragmatic response to wartime needs became one of the most effective demolitions of Nazi ideology. Unlike propaganda lectures or forced re-education, this exposure came in the form of unfiltered observation. The prisoners saw with their own eyes what their captors' society was capable of producing, and no amount of rhetoric could shield them from the truth. On farms across Texas, Nebraska, and Kansas, they witnessed machinery that defied their imagination. A single combine harvester accomplished in one day what would have required 100 men using traditional German methods. In Nebraska's sugar beet fields, prisoners calculated that the yields were nearly double the best German harvests. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, working outside Scottsbluff, marveled at a 16-year-old farm boy who casually drove a tractor worth more than his father had earned in a lifetime. When Hoffmann remarked on this, the boy laughed and said it was not even a particularly good tractor. His father was waiting on a new model from John Deere. For soldiers raised in a culture of scarcity, such casual prosperity was impossible to dismiss. Factories delivered even more shocking revelations. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners were not allowed to work directly on war material, but they were permitted to assist in industries that freed American workers for the front lines. In a Campbell's soup plant in New Jersey, German POW watched as automated lines processed more tomatoes in a single day than German factories managed in a month. Machines handled tasks that would have required dozens of laborers in Germany, while a handful of women and older men supervised the process, drinking coffee and listening to radios as they worked. Ernst Wagner, a former food processor in Hamburg, noted that one elderly woman did the work of 50 German workers simply by monitoring a row of switches. Everything was electric, everything was automated, he recorded. It was as if we had stepped into the future. Even more impressive was Detroit's River Rouge complex, one of the largest industrial sites in the world. POW unloading coal at a nearby power plant glimpsed the sprawling facility across the river. At full capacity, it employed 100 zero workers and produced jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks. The plant consumed 1.5 million kilowatts of electricity daily, more than the entire city of Hamburg. Yet what stunned the Germans most was not the machinery, but the cars parked outside. Thousands of workers, many of them women, owned personal vehicles. In Germany, even officers rarely had cars, while here ordinary factory laborers often owned two. We thought the guard was mocking us when he said many workers had a family car and a work car, recalled one prisoner. But there it was, plain before our eyes. The effect of these experiences began to show in the camps. American intelligence officers described a phenomenon they called ideological collapse syndrome. The most ardent Nazis grew quiet. Many prisoners, once defiant, now requested access to newspapers, books, and English classes. Camp newspapers, produced by the prisoners themselves, gradually shifted in tone. What began as nationalist publications soon included articles about democracy, economics, and even America's role in post-war reconstruction. For many, the turning point came not from machines, but from human kindness. Christmas, 1943, struck the deepest blow to Nazi racial ideology. Across the United States, churches, civic groups, and families sent more than 500,000 Christmas packages to German prisoners, men who, only months earlier, had been shooting at their sons and husbands. Each package contained small luxuries, cigarettes, candy, toiletries, or games. In Camp Hirn, the local Methodist choir performed carols in German, while women baked cookies and cakes for the prisoners. The Boy Scouts even delivered handmade cards. Feldwebel Walter Muller, whose own brother had been killed in Hamburg, could not comprehend the generosity. "They know we are their enemies," he wrote. "Yet they show us Christian charity, not propaganda but genuine kindness. What kind of people treat enemies this way? Only those absolutely certain of victory." The Christmas feast itself was unforgettable. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, pies, and ice cream. Quantities of food that no German soldier or civilian had seen since before the First World War. Prisoners ate until they were sick. "Better than generals, better than party leaders," wrote Hans Mayer, and this, they told us, was a normal American Christmas. Every family ate the same meal. If they feed us like this, what must their soldiers be eating? Such experiences broke through even the most stubborn defenses. Ideology collapsed not under lectures, but under the simple weight of reality, abundance, kindness, and a society that thrived without terror. By early 1944, more than 40,000 German POW were enrolled in education programs. Universities provided correspondence courses, professors visited camps to lecture, and prisoners studied English, mathematics, history, and political theory. Many who had arrived believing America was a mongrel nation now read its newspapers, compared its competing viewpoints, and discovered that freedom of criticism was not weakness but strength. For men who had grown up in a system where dissent meant imprisonment or death, this revelation carried more power than any battlefront victory. The war for their minds was being won quietly, with textbooks, movies, and even holiday dinners. By the summer of 1944, the transformation of Germany's prisoners of war in America was nearly complete. Every day in the camps, on farms, and in factories, they had seen evidence that their homeland's claims of superiority were hollow. Yet the final blows came not from machinery or meals, but from the unfolding events of the war itself, especially the Allied invasion of France. When news of D-Day reached the camps in June 1944, many prisoners experienced a moment of profound collapse. The scale of the Operation 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 150,000 men in the first wave was beyond imagination. Prisoners gathered in camp theaters to watch newsreels of the landings. They saw artificial harbors constructed on open beaches, endless supply lines feeding troops by the tens of thousands, and fleets of aircraft swarming the skies. Feldwebel Friedrich von Tauben wrote bluntly, "We knew then that everything was lost, not only the war, but the entire Nazi project. We had challenged the greatest industrial power on earth with fairy tales and mythology. Yet what shattered them most was not just scale, but contrast." In Germany, factories operated on starvation rations, workers lived in fear, and civilians endured constant shortages. In America, even as the war reached its peak, POW saw farmers eating beef sandwiches during lunch breaks, families shopping in stores filled with goods, and children going to school in towns ablaze with electric light. The gap was unbridgeable, and they knew it. For many, the kindness shown by ordinary Americans was the most disarming of all. When Lieutenant Paul Fischer's wife in Germany wrote that she was struggling to feed their children, American church groups quietly sent food packages across the Atlantic, despite the fact that Germany was still bombing Allied cities. When Gerhard Muller received word that his son had died in the Hamburg raids, the American camp commander personally delivered the Red Cross message and offered condolences. These small acts of compassion pierced deeper than any propaganda. "They told us they fought Hitler, not the German people," one prisoner recalled, and they proved it. The re-education programs expanded alongside these experiences. By early 1945, over 25,000 German prisoners had volunteered for classes on democracy, economics, and history. Universities like Chicago and Stanford provided materials and even sent lecturers to the camps. Prisoners studied in earnest, driven not by compulsion but by genuine hunger for knowledge. Some attended lectures on physics from Jewish refugee professors, men their government had labeled enemies of the Reich. To their astonishment, these teachers showed no hatred, only a willingness to share ideas. For soldiers steeped in a culture of racial superiority, this openness was transformative. They were years ahead of us in research, one physicist later admitted, and they taught us freely even as enemies. This generosity of spirit we could not comprehend. The cultural exposure was equally powerful. Camp theaters screened Hollywood films, not propaganda, but honest depictions of American life. Prisoners watched Gone with the Wind and The Grapes of Wrath, shocked that Americans would show their own struggles and flaws so openly. In Nazi Germany, criticism of the regime meant imprisonment or death. Here, self-criticism was considered patriotic. They hide nothing, wrote Lieutenant Joseph Kramer. Their honesty makes them stronger, not weaker. Slowly, the prisoners came to see democracy not as chaos, but as resilience. By the war's end in 1945, many of these men were no longer Nazis in spirit. They had arrived as fanatics, convinced of German superiority, but they left as reluctant admirers of the very society they had been taught to despise. American authorities prepared them for repatriation with vocational training, agricultural education, and even lessons on constitutional government. When they returned to a ruined Germany, they carried with them seeds of transformation. Some became farmers who introduced American machinery and techniques. Others became educators, politicians, and diplomats. The economic miracle of West Germany in the 1950s owed part of its success to lessons learned in captivity. Historians later concluded that America's greatest victory was not on the battlefield, but in its prison camps. Without coercion, without brainwashing, the sheer evidence of a free society's prosperity converted hardened Nazis into future Democrats. Every full plate of food, every electric light, every working toilet stood as an argument against tyranny. When thousands of former prisoners later immigrated to America or maintained friendships with American families, they testified to the depth of that transformation. One former POW captured the essence of this experience at a reunion decades later. "We came as enemies. We left as students. America showed us that strength lies not in conquest, but in creation, not in hatred, but in diversity, not in tyranny, but in freedom." His words summed up the truth that millions of German soldiers never understood until it was too late. In the end, the arsenal of democracy's most powerful weapon was not its bombs or tanks, but its ability to inspire through example. The men who returned to Germany carried that inspiration with them, and with it, the foundation for a new and better world.